Hello, my name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow, and I'm the Director of Education for the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision of a future in which humans and other animals live as one community in peace and wellness. Given all that's unfolded in the past year, these conversations are more important than ever. For they are more than mere conversations. They are opportunities for building community, salve for the isolating wounds of our time. Through Living One, together we attempt to answer the question, we know it's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Sara Granovetter, PhD, an ecopsychologist and educator. Sara completed her dissertation in 2021 entitled The Asymmetrical Mirror, Nonhuman Subject as Shadow and Self at California Institute of Integral Studies in Ecopsychology Concentration. A former intern at Kerulos, Sara holds a master's in counseling psychology and a BA in philosophy from Harvard University. For the past 10 years, Sara has worked as a somatic depth psychotherapist in private practice and as director of Fiddleheads, a nature-based program for children with social, emotional learning differences. Recently, Sara has shifted her attention towards ecopsychology and animal advocacy, serving as visiting scholar at the Animals in Society Institute Summer Institute in 2017, and in 2019 presenting the workshop, The Rupture Within, Healing the Trans-Species Psyche at the Reciprocal Healing Conference in Sedona, Arizona. Sara's publications and research explore both collective trauma and unconscious defenses embedded in our society, defenses designed to protect us from feeling deep grief about what we do to animals and ourselves. So welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for being here. And interviewing Sara today is the director of the Kerulos Center, Gay Bradshaw.
Hi, everyone. Sara, welcome. This is delightful.
Thank you. Glad to be
through the course of the interview, we'll be digging at all the aspects of your very dense and beautiful dissertation. But I'd like to just start off with asking you as an example, because this is sort of work in action, and your dissertation and your background in action. Describe the conference that you, the workshop that you led in the conference, and some of your experiences with that. What was the purpose of that? It was kind of an unusual thing, and I think it epitomizes sort of the nexus of a number of different ideas, views, and disciplines that are coming together in common ground.
Okay. The Reciprocal Healing Conference specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I presented a workshop that was co-designed with you. And it was at a workshop called Reciprocal Healing. And it was all about how can we heal nature and heal ourselves kind of simultaneously. How is healing nature healing ourselves, and vice versa? And so the workshop that I presented was designed to explore the ways that we unconsciously separate ourselves and dissociate from the plight of non-human animals, and kind of turn away from places that may be particularly tender or raw. And so the purpose of the workshop was to really explore, really make a space for people to explore the relationship with non-human animals, explore the places where they maybe feel uneasy in their relationship to non-human animals, where they may feel that they are not quite in right relationship, and to make a kind of non-judgmental space to really look at what that brings up, look at what's behind that, what creates this rupture between us and non-human animals. How are we impacted when we see or hear about non-human animals being harmed, and how are we impacted when we sense at some level that we are complicit in that harm? And so the idea was to create a space where people could really explore that, really go through their different relationships and excavate those pieces that they may have been burying. And the conference itself was it was a very eye-opening experience because, generally in a lot of, as many of you may know, in a lot of environmental ecology conferences and organizations, it's not always it's the animal rights and animal advocacy does not always gel so well in those kinds of settings. And so I found myself really wanting to be a voice for animals in that space. And I was actually surprised at how open people the conference were to considering animals in a different way. So for instance, one of the presenters responded to a question where a hunter stood up and said, hey, like, can shooting and killing a deer to feed my family dinner, can that be an act of love? And the presenter was like, yeah, oh my gosh, absolutely, of course, just sort of a very quick answer. And so I really felt very compelled to stand up and say, I'm not going to say what's right or wrong here, but I think we need to take a little time before we say yes. Before we say yes to those questions, we really want to decenter ourselves, really consider, is that an act of love? And for whom? For whom is that an act of love? And in kind of speaking into that space kind of hadn't been spoken into yet, there was a lot of positive response in the audience, a lot of people coming up and thanking me for bringing that in, like 30, 40 people coming up to me afterwards and thanking me for making that comment. And so that gave me a lot of hope, seeing that.
So what you're talking about is it's still very prevalent. I mean, there's in understanding nature or the environment is this sort of like a tableau, that is anonymous.
Right.
May be populated with wolves or bears and other kinds of animals, and yet from the quote unquote animal advocacy, animal rights groups, or our personal beliefs and understanding, there's no personalization.
Right.
If there's any kind of personalization, then the personalization is from the human in terms of personalizing that space for themselves.
Right. Yeah. And I love your comment on that subject where you said nature has a face, right? It's not just a faceless, experienceless, anonymous field, but it actually is filled with different individual experiences that it's really vital we consider.
So what, it's really quite terrific that you're sort of mobbed with your comment. Where do you think that can go? In other words, there was obviously individuals in the audience that were silent on that. So I have two questions. So I guess one is, why were people silent? Why were you the only one that stood up? I guess maybe three. I'll make three questions. Two is, wow, that was really fast. The idea of kill and love in the same sentence, no matter what kind of context, that's really extraordinary. So maybe I'll say the third of where it's going to go. But if you could comment on that as a psychologist in terms of you were the only one that stood up and spoke, and yet, you were mobbed. And then the other one was kill and love in that statement. In one thing with this sort of, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So why did I stand up and speak? I mean, I think that personally, I've always had a predilection for speaking what others aren't speaking, for saying what's uncomfortable, for really speaking up for those beings that don't have voices. So that's definitely something within my own disposition. And in terms of, why other people felt this agreement and felt this relief when I spoke, yet didn't stand up themselves, I think that, this kind of points to some of the research that I've been doing, some of what I've been writing about in my dissertation, that actually a lot of the resistance to animal advocacy messages and to kind of including animals in larger environmental conversations is not necessarily about a lack of caring. It's not necessarily about apathy or kind of a kind of moral bereftness, but it may actually be about something deeper, something more unconscious, that causes people to defend against exploring these issues and speaking out. and speaking out and receiving information about them. So I know that might be hard for particularly those of us or those of you who are like longtime veteran sanctuary workers and vegan activists, kind of war weary workers. I mean, I imagine when I say that, it might make you want to roll your eyes because for you, it's so obvious, right? For you, it's like, how can I, now that I've reached this tipping point, how can I not act? How can I not change? But I actually think that the topic of animals and animal advocacy brings up a lot of complex feelings for a lot of people. And I think there's actually a lot of collective trauma around this topic. And so, my research is focusing on this collective trauma and these unconscious defenses that come into play when we're faced with species loss and the systemic cruelty of industrial animal enterprises. And because in a lot of like AR campaigns and AR narratives, there's sort of an underlying feeling that maybe people don't care enough, or like maybe they don't get it, or maybe they're callous. There's a lot of messaging that comes through in the form of kind of chastisement, maybe shaming, even shouting. There's kind of a politics of guilt underlying the field of animal advocacy. But what if that care actually is present for people that are resistant to animal advocacy messages? Maybe what if it's even present in surplus? Now, this is an idea that's taken from Renee Lertzman, who conducted a study on environmental melancholia and unconscious barriers to environmental action. And what she really found is that this kind of trance-like collusion that Claire Mann points to in her concept of dystopia. So just to go back a little bit, dystopia, Claire Mann just defines that as the existential crisis experienced by vegans arising out of an awareness of the trance-like collusion with the dystopian world. It's an awareness of the greed, ubiquitous animal exploitation, and speciesism in a modern dystopia. And so what if this trance-like collusion that she's talking about kind of points to the unconscious? What if hearing about animals being harmed, and I'm not talking about for everybody, this is for a certain segment of the population. What about for a certain, maybe majority segment of the population, hearing about animals being harmed and learning and feeling their own sense of guilt and being complicit in that triggers deep, deep feelings of anxiety, grief, loss, guilt, feelings that for some people may feel like a electric minefield, may just seem too painful to confront.
Well, let me just wind back a teeny bit before you go on, just to get everyone up to speed, including myself, just real quick.
Yeah. So
when, in the example, when you spoke out and others didn't, but they gathered around, typically, isn't it typical? I won't say typically. I'll speak from my own experience. Like, for example, if I'm in a meeting, or sometimes I've been at a conference or some kind of gathering, and something is said that I don't feel comfortable with, it could be a racist remark, could be whatever it is. There's a tension that comes up in terms of group and saying something that will alienate you from the group. And so I was wondering whether that was an element in there. In other words, the people, when you spoke, that there were so many that did not. And to me, my first read is that at least a component of the resistance for those people who did not speak out was social alienation from the group.
Yes, absolutely.
A few things about that.
Yeah, I think that's.
Why? I mean, what is it about it? I mean, you've been describing it, but at the same time, there's a kind of a tension. I mean, I guess what I'm going to say is that I'll sort of preempt it. Is what I think, and we've discussed this before, is that something like about speaking out for the animals, or speaking out for particularly animals. I think. But it really challenges the human-human contract, the primacy of the human-human contract. Do you think that that sort of is at play in that one example or experience you had?
The human, I like that idea of the human-human contract. I think absolutely.
When I speak out, whatever topic it is, and if someone says something, I am criticizing the group. I could be criticizing a single person, but I'm really criticizing the group, and I'm making myself separate by saying something.
Exactly. Right. I think that is a huge factor. And there's something about aligning with a human identity also versus aligning with this more trans-species identity that you've talked about in some of your research, that when I speak out for non-humans, maybe it feels like I'm shifting alliance, and that might feel like there's a fear that, oh my goodness, I'm betraying humanity, I'm betraying fellow humans. But I also, in addition to that, I think that part of that social alienation speaks to unconscious mechanisms that are at play in the culture as a whole, in society as a whole. So for instance, there are mechanisms in the cultural unconscious that are built to deflect, silence, and kind of reinterpret emotional responses to normative practices of animal harm. And so there's a way that these responses are not allowed to enter into collective discourse. And so when in that conference, I kind of almost ruptured. For me, I also thought of it as in a way of rupturing a veil, rupturing an unspoken veil of silence that is built into the unconscious of the culture. And so I think that could be about kind of betraying the human-human contract. I think it's probably overdetermined. I think it's also about some of this agreement together that we're not going to awaken that kind of guilt. We're not going to awaken that kind of probing of our normative actions, of our everyday actions. There's sort of a collective consensus in the group that that we're not going to create that discomfort for each other. But at the same time, based on the response, it tells me there's a readiness maybe in the collective psyche. There's a readiness and even a longing to rupture that veil, to acknowledge that actually that we do feel a resonance with the non-human world. We do feel like many of us do feel more of a trans-species identity than we might let on. So I think it speaks to both those levels for me.
Well, in some ways, being pro environment or pro climate change, in a way can also be perhaps psychologically kind of an exoneration. So I've checked that box, and so I'm fine. I'm just talking about psychologically. I'm asking you. So that I'm really concerned, and the people I knew, some of the people in the organizers. They're very dedicated to. I hate using the term to nature, just on nature rather than the environment, and they're very learned in terms of understanding the private lives of plants and the ecosystems. And again, I hate that term because it's so clinical. But so there is an intimacy.
Yeah.
So a number of the people, at least that I was familiar with, that had organized, et cetera, there's an intimacy they have with nature. And yet there, at the same time, there is maybe kind of a fear of intimacy in a reciprocal kind of way. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say, in the sense of the animal and the sameness, the trans-species, et cetera. That introduces a kind of vulnerability in it when we shift our identity, that kind of vulnerability. If we see the animals as one of us,
Yeah.
then there is a vulnerability that we have not only among our group, but also in terms of whatever the architecture and the agenda of this particular dominating culture has sought to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, does that at all connect to, and you might want to say a few words just in case people aren't familiar with the term of collective trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that a little bit more. Does that connect then to collective trauma in some sense? Or is collective trauma then part and parcel of this whole issue?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that
so what is collective? First define what,
yeah, there's a lot to say.
Describe what collective trauma would be. We're familiar, most of us are familiar probably with personal trauma, whether something has happened to us or someone else, or there's a collective trauma like a genocide. Is that, or how does that fit in? Maybe just expand, because you've done a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, right. So collective trauma, we can use that term when there is kind of a systemic, when there is something that happens on the cultural level, on the social level, that kind of ruptures and affects like the very tissues of the social fabric, that affects every aspect of life, and that it resides in every single individual in that society's consciousness on some level. And it's sort of a shared trauma that the culture experiences together. So for example, when speaking about collective trauma, it's common to reference genocides. I mean, that's probably the most, if not only, I'm trying to think of other examples, but that's definitely the most common example of collective trauma.
You can localize it, like for example, I forgot. It's just not my mind. But Kai, I forgot his last name. Right, Kai Erickson. I mean, he was talking about. I don't know if he even used that term, but a particular community.
Yeah.
Smaller scale through a natural phenomena.
Yeah.
Collective trauma.
Right. Yeah, it can certainly operate at different scales. And so one of the things I suggest in my research is that the institution of kind of harmful industrial animal enterprises actually creates a kind of collective trauma into our culture. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going around, feeling traumatized and having flashbacks about industrial animal farms. But what it does mean is that our society becomes structured in the way that trauma is structured, so that there becomes an unspeakable and an unsayable, and a place in society that is the thing about which you may not speak. And what happens is that a large portion of the population, and even in the discourse of the culture itself, it introduces the defenses, even just for example, one example of an unconscious defense is projection. So one example of projection, just to define that, is when you, something within you that you experience as something you don't want to be part of your identity, or something that seems unbearable to feel, you attribute it to somebody else. You imagine that it's in somebody else, and you maybe even place it in someone else. So one example of projection is that animal activists that go in and, do open rescues and try to save animals and try to shed light on what's happening to animals in industrial farms are labeled as terrorists. They're labeled as violent. And so we could see that as projection, in that those who are projecting that identity on animals might actually possess guilt and a feeling that they are violent, right? That they are doing violent things to animals. And in projecting that onto activists, they don't have to experience themselves that way. So there's all kinds of different forms of unconscious defenses. And so So just coming back to, I know you're asking me about collective trauma. The presence of unconscious defenses like that is one sign that there is something that those defenses are constellating around, right? There's something that we don't want to feel and look at together. And that's part of maintaining a cultural identity that, we're good people, Americans, or, whatever kind of Western industrial culture you're talking about. We're good people. We're not violent. This sort of identity, it sort of maintains the identity not to look at this. And so what happens then is that animal advocates become kind of symptom bearers of this trauma, and they begin to rupture the trauma into the collective. And so, there's trauma, there's defenses, and then there's symptoms, right? There's symptoms that come across, affect-laden symptoms. And animal activists kind of, they embody that aspect of the collective trauma. So I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a way that trauma is operating. The whole mechanism of trauma is operating on a broader scale, and where different members of the society are enacting different parts of the cultural trauma. So I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any other questions or places that I can clarify that.
So do you think there's a parallel, for example, in terms of, let's say, COVID or this past year and a half? What was precipitated, I don't know what you want to call it, the convergence of things, the perfect storm, but politically, with the climate change and with the COVID, at least that's how I see it. It seemed like one of these sort of perfect storm things where you're really getting your quote unquote reality is turned upside down. Do you see that there's a parallel there in terms of, is there a collective trauma that people are experiencing now, having been forced to see through the veil that you talk about?
Yeah. Do you mean in a way that there is like that collective trauma has kind of started to move through the stages of kind of denial into rupture and healing? Is that what you? Yeah, I think certainly to some extent, certainly with respect to, the way our systems are designed, the way, American industrial capitalism affects the climate and affects our well-being and health. I think there's a lot of awakenings around that. I don't know with respect to, animal advocacy and awareness around animals, whether that's fully ruptured yet. But yeah, I definitely think there's movement.
So do you think this framing then, the way you've approached it, how can that be used in terms of revisioning or visioning a future or a present path to a future that is more aligned with reality? In other words, the reality being, depends on what you call reality, but within the confines. If we talk about the notion of animal sentience, and which is established within the confines of very conservative within the society, aka science, etc. If we see that, do you feel that this analysis of collective trauma can be harnessed somehow in sort of facilitating this revisioning of the world we're talking about, is living in respect and dignity with other animals on the planet?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's something that's sort of deeply needed, and there's beginning to be a awakening around in environmental advocacy, which is trauma-informed advocacy, and even like unconsciously informed advocacy, because I think that a lot of kind of AR advocacy is designed around like, okay, just give them the information, show them the images, like let them know what's going on over and over and over again. And that works to a certain extent, but I think it's missing something. And I think that both animal activists and those targets of animal activism actually end up polarizing in many cases. There ends up being something called splitting, which is we're split into those are the good people over there and those are the bad people over there. And both AR activists and recipients of advocacy are guilty of that. Many AR advocates, I think, and sanctuary workers, and it's so easy to succumb to this feeling that, like dystopia, basically, right? Like, what is wrong with the world? Like, how, like, I must be an alien. And, I, in an interview with one of the activists, he said that he doesn't talk to people who are non-vegan for the same reason he doesn't fraternize with child abusers. He doesn't think of it any differently. And so I think it's really easy to sink into that kind of despair. But when we start approaching others in that way, it actually brings up more shame for them. It brings up more defense and more guilt, and then more of a need to defend, right? And so I think that, a path towards healing here could be, first of all, animal advocates really doing their own work. On one hand, really looking into and feeling through the grief and reparation and anger, right, that they hold, really looking at what it means to them. Because of course, when we want to help and we care so much, we want to just do. And there's a lot of discussion of that, like sustainable activism. But I think that sometimes as advocates, we're not always fully conscious of what's driving us and what parallels in our own lives are kind of driving us to speak for animals. What parts of us actually need tending along with the animals? What part of us resonates with the animal that's feeling immensely vulnerable, that's feeling young or kind of primally harmed, right, by this industrial capitalist system, and also doing the work there so that we're not just projecting it all outwards. I'm not saying don't advocate for animals, but doing it with the depth and resonance of our own work behind it. And then simultaneously, I think that as opposed to kind of the sort of politics of guilt that is so common, creating spaces that are actually not designed to force change and that are not designed to shame or inform, but to actually explore the ambiguities of these issues, to explore our guilt, to explore our grief, to explore our feelings of powerlessness around the immensity of like animal enterprise. Spaces where vegans and non-vegans alike can share. They can share anger at each other. They can share, held psychologically informed spaces to discuss these topics from a psychologically informed perspective. And then, in the third case, designing advocacy, right, that is more nuanced, that can understand what this can bring up for the public. Because the truth is, like, I'm just going to look up this poll. In 2014, the National Council for Animal Protection found that 79% of people in the US believe that animals should be protected from all suffering and harm caused by humans. And another Gallup poll in 2015 showed that one third of Americans believe that animals should have the same rights as people. I mean, those are pretty astounding numbers. And of course, they don't add up with the number of vegans and the number of animal advocates out there. So that's a place to explore what's inside of that discrepancy. So yeah, I think that sort of summarizes my thoughts on that for now.
Well, I know I'll just be the sort of the devil's advocate that an activist or whatever you want to call it, animal person would say, well, the onus is on us. Well, why isn't it on society or the the people who are in denial or are economically benefiting from this and socially benefiting from this? I mean, I think, in other words, that I've heard that, it's sort of like, well, yeah, but really where the problems lie are the mechanisms which facilitate, for example, not to pick on the conference, it was just something that we started off with, but what are the mechanisms which enable and facilitate people at the conference being silenced? What are those? I mean, if you look, for example, even at graduate school, a lot of these people were from, academia and in some way or another. A lot of academia facilitates and enables the status quo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, even the number one Peter Singer, who's, I think he's a chair at Princeton in animal something, which was extraordinary. He himself is not, as I was told, is not a vegan. He's a proponent of effective altruism, which is basically, from my point of view, it's kind of has overtones of very unpleasant kinds of regimes. We do it by numbers. We don't care about the individuals. We're just doing it by numbers, etc. So, there's a lot of different kinds of mechanisms which are maintaining the illusion. Mm-hmm. How and I could say activism, I don't have time to do all this self, analysis. I'm too busy, saving animals per se. Any thoughts about how that might be negotiated? I mean, you've said some wonderful things and everything, but how would you suggest that? Would you suggest having some kind of, more gatherings?
Yeah, I mean,
or something where there would be parlaying in some fashion and allowing for that kind of discourse?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I heard you say a couple things. I mean, I heard you in some ways talking about the privilege of not having to look at this, that we're kind of carrying this for those, that there's a certain, there are structures in place that allow people to not have to see and feel, what people in animal advocacy see and feel. And that feels like quite a burden. And I think that's absolutely true. And, it kind of reminds me in some ways of the trope, as a therapist, like the trope of the wounded healer. And that there's a way through that kind of wounding and suffering of not being able to help caring about animals, right? That kind of translates into this mission and calling in life, right? That we can't not do. And of course, I understand, like, there's, some of what I'm saying, like the seasoned advocate is going to be rolling their eyes and being like, well, like, I've gotten through these unconscious defenses. Like, I can't go back. Like, why should I have to like cater to people that are sort of blissfully unaware? And I think that it does sort of require a little bit of a perspective shift in how we see those others. Of course, there is a certain privilege and sort of a blissful unawareness in not engaging in this work, but at the same time, there's I believe, a lot of underlying anxiety and a lot of underlying, in the collective and in the individual that kind of holds that up. And so part of it is, in a way, how do we choose, like as advocates, how do we choose to see others? Like, maybe this isn't even 100% true. Let's just say that. But what would it be like if we saw others as essentially caring, but deeply psychologically conflicted and defended, right? How would that change how we approach them? And, part of why I did this work is because I found myself feeling very alienated in the world and feeling like, how do people not see what I see? Like, how are people just turning their head to animals? And I felt myself kind of sinking into this like alienated advocate position, and it didn't feel good. It didn't feel right. And it felt very separating. And I didn't feel like I could do the work thinking I was separate and split off from all other human beings. So part of this work was like motivated by a desire to see the humanity, and I mean, of course, that's a terrible loaded word, to see the vulnerable care in others that seemed callous. And so in terms of your question about like, what do we do? More specifically, I think that first thing I want to say is we can't do it alone. right? Like it's not, I'm not saying we should sit and, maybe some people can sit inside and meditate and go into analysis and really look at what's motivating them. But I don't think we can do this alone. I think that people are involved in advocacy. It should be much more normalized to have space to process emotions. Some of the advocates that I spoke to who are involved in like open rescue and that kind of thing, like they talked about how it was really frowned upon to get too emotional, even in the AR groups, that it was kind of seen as weakness, and there was a certain hierarchy of being really strong. And so there's a way that even as advocates, we feel like there's not really spaces to fully process and explore those emotions. And so I think really normalizing, creating spaces in advocacy groups, outside of advocacy groups, for advocates to process and explore what's motivating them, and what the impact is and what else is going on is vital. I think also having spaces that are more inviting towards those who are non-vegan and those who are ambivalent and conflicted, right? I'm not necessarily talking, here, I'm not necessarily talking about trying to bring in like your die cast, like, generations long, like bear hunters into the fold, so I'm not necessarily talking about everybody here, but there's a big portion of the population that are conflicted and curious, that may feel alienated by the kind of the sort of do or die or black or white vibe that they get in animal rights campaigns, and may shy away from engaging. But inviting and creating more curious spaces, meetings, workshops, problem-solving campaigns that are inviting and understanding towards those who are not already converts, and also places to process, and campaigns that are inviting rather than chastising.
Thank you. That was great. I'll leave some time for, I'm sure people have lots of comments and questions. I guess the last thing that I will say is that, to me, what's really facing all of humanity, or, the large part, at least, that I come in contact and see in various ways, is are we up to changing our identity? I mean, this is cross-cutting, not just having to do with species, but ethnicity and gender and things like that. Are we up to, being able to embrace a fluidity in terms of our identity?
Yeah. In some ways, I think we're being forced to.
Yeah, and that's kind of the, do you bend or brittle, bend or break in that way. Thank you so much, Sarah. I won't use up all the time because I know there'll be lots of questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So before we switch to the Q&A, I just wanted to do a quick plug that we will be having our next webinar event on July 11th. That's actually the second Sunday of the month, and it'll be author Derek Jensen. So we hope you join us. So assisting me today with the Q&A is Lauren Bailey, a board member here at the Kerulos Center. And I do see that we have a hand up already with Risa. So I'll just start there. Risa?
Thank you, Liz, Kay, and Sarah, particularly for mentioning that you're always the one who speaks up. So I call that the fall guy, and I have long held that role, to my dismay, because I do wind up getting alienated. But I'm thinking, as you were talking, since cultures have long had roles of fools, tricksters, gadflies, prophets, wounded healers, just for the sake of conversation, to lump them all together. They're, of course, very unique and all, but so serving in a role to wake up society. And so I think you're really onto something with an operative defense mechanism. I think it's projective identification, because we are carrying the guilt, the sorrow, the grief. So let's support one another and be mindful of our own self-care. So yeah, in the very beginning of your talk, when you talked about the love and kill, I thought of indigenous practices, hunting, and I have found this conflict arising then, like wanting to support indigenous practices, but then oops, and feeling reluctant to speak out. There's this kind of, I don't know if it's political correctness, but and then I think of clitoridectomies, like, yeah, people spoke out and went to the UN, and well, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That is such a tender territory, right? It's really difficult to know how to trod there, because right. And I think that topic is something that's, in some ways, because right now there's such a movement towards indigenous rights, there may be something around timing. There may actually be something around the timing of speaking that also is aware of collective defenses and the collective unconscious. But I think that's partly, like, when I spoke up at the conference, I tried, not to say I said the perfect thing, but I tried to kind of read the temperature of the room. And what I ended up saying wasn't, oh, that it's wrong, or that, like, that killing isn't loving. But I just asked everybody to pause before they answered that question. And I think sometimes, rather than, sometimes I just want to speak out and be like, what the hell are you doing? This is ridiculous. And this is wrong. There is an action of, like, holding back and just saying, what is the next step of unfolding an awareness that this group or this person is ready for? And so maybe it is just pausing.
The power of the pause.
Yes. Thank you.
I'll make a quick interjection, and I don't know how to do the hand thing, so I do it by this way. I feel compelled to make this comment. Thank you, Risa, for bringing that up about indigenous, political, all that, and Sarah. I think really we have to look at culture. We're looking at human culture. Here in Oregon, for example, we had a bill coming up against banning coyote killing contests, and a number of states have banned those contests. And people were involved here, and our center was one of the people involved who were talking with legislatures and all, and this wonderful woman named Kelly from the Humane Society was kind of bringing the coalition together. And the complaints were from the opposition was a culture war against rural Oregon. And there's a fellow named Charles Wilkinson who used to be a professor, I believe, at Oregon, I think it's in Colorado, and he wrote a book. And he used to talk about the lords of yesteryear. So he talked about them of, mining and timber and water, and I've forgotten. And he was basically saying that, he wrote a very eloquent book, but basically saying that there's these interest groups that are just like glacial erratics, meaning they have no relationship to the present social, ecological, spiritual landscape. And they have this power, but there's nothing. They're totally disjunct from quote unquote reality, and they're these leftovers. And essentially, I think that that's a really important point. Is culture, human minds, is fluid. We evolve. Maybe we can talk about that from a religious, spiritual perspective, but just in a general thing, there's evolution. We change, and the environment has changed. The ocean is no longer full of whales and sea life. The lands are barren. There's epidemic post-traumatic stress among animals as well as the plants. So in other words, that the conditions by which we're, putting culture and quote unquote nature and making these balances like that is very different. And I think that's a really important point. In terms of the fluidity, we talked about fluidity in the evolution. So when we're talking about hunting is a very different, whether it's right or wrong, whatever. But the point is that the whole culture around a particular hunting practice is in a very, very different kind of setting. And I think that's an important point to bring up and to have, to keep in mind. Otherwise, we are in this, political correctness stalemate. From my point of view, things are not the same. And our knowledge is not the same. Our understanding is not the same. There are other threads that may be the same. But those kinds of things need to be brought into the conversation. Otherwise, we're just stuck with nature in between, suffering from it all. Well, that's my editorial. Thank you.
I think I just want to say one brief thing. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, one of the unconscious defenses, one of the things that defenses do is protect against identity threats, right? Threats to identity, threats to personal identity, threats to collective and cultural identity. And because right now, because some of these indigenous cultures have experienced, of course, so much identity threat already and are maybe just coming back into reestablishing identity, it may be that to like your sense of like the kind of precariousness of speaking there may be based on the fact that that defense structure may be not designed to welcome any identity threats at this moment that may come from pointing that out. But there may be some that are more ready to evolve, right? Or can withstand.
Readiness or not, these are things that have to be brought into conversations.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a kind that keeps a transparency, that keeps a respect. Otherwise, we're just dealing with cartoons.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think maybe the question is, like, how do we bring that in so it can be received?
Yeah. Thank you both. I think we have a question from Caitlin Collins. Mute. There we go.
Oh yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, I'm actually in England and Exmoor National Park, and I'm really, really happy to be here. And thank you so much for putting these seminars on. So I have a question, which is that we've been talking about animal advocacy, either kind of in isolation as an entity itself, or in its relationship with environmentalism. And I was just wondering if you could say something about the value or otherwise of linking with common causes for sharing theories and methodologies. And the two that come to mind for me, obviously, is the link with feminism, especially ecofeminism, looking at the sort of patriarchal ethos of hierarchy and dominance. And then the other one being Buddhism and Jainism, which obviously talk about sentient beings. And so you've got that it dissolves that very hard and fast division between humans and animals that is so prevalent in our culture. And I just wondered if you could say something about the possibility of linking animal advocacy, with common cause like feminism and Buddhism and Jainism, if you think that would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think there is work that links, there is work that links animal advocacy and ecofeminism. Gay, maybe you're, my brain for names right now.
Carol Adams is one of the stronger writers about ecofeminism and animal advocacy.
Right.
Yeah. That's one name that I can.
Right. And feminist care ethics, basically looks at, and it kind of gels really well with this approach of kind of being trauma informed and emotionally informed, where it talks about typically like feminist responses to, not feminist, feminine responses to animal suffering, like sadness, emotion, feeling hysterical, that these should actually be more normalized, because there was a big, a lot of movement to kind of make animal discussions about animal rights much more philosophical, much more objective, much more scientific, all these, and that emotions had no place in it. Actually, that subtracted from the cause. And so feminist care ethics are trying to validate that as a actually important information to introduce. So, I mean, I think, of course, there can be so much more done.
Yeah, there's a very strong development. It's sort of as a base from the work of Carol Adams and others, is that, and this is being put forward more recently, is that the failure of the animal rights movement is because it's harnessed by and it's governed by the principles and ethics of, sorry for those here, the white male patriarchy, the same things, also capitalism, et cetera, and economics. And so there's a number of researchers and writers that are really coming out very outspokenly about that the movement itself, the efficacy, the internal dynamics are patriarchal and dominating, and that in itself causes internal turmoil and abuse within the movement as well. That's something. And another thing, there is Jenny Wiegand is here. There is a group of Buddhists. Caitlin, I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but there is a group of Buddhists. One is, you probably know, is Tara Brach. Will Tuttle, who's a vegan, a plant-based proponent, that are Buddhist-based, and they have an organization that is active sort of globally in a way of promoting that connection for animals.
Thank you.
Here, Molly.
Oh no, I was going to say Molly's just said in the chat, Dharma voices for animals. That might be worth.
I know that one. Yes, thank you.
Did anyone else have any questions for Sara?
Sara, I'll just ask a quick question for you. Do you plan on I know you just moved and things are kind of up in the air, but do you plan, or are you thinking of engaging in more conferences, for example, like the one that you participated in environmental? In other words, in venues that would include animals but aren't necessarily represented by what you call animal advocacy and animal rights.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Once I get settled, I love kind of infiltrating in those kinds of settings. I think that's a really powerful place to kind of bring animal voices. So I certainly, I'm particularly interested in ecopsychology and even like conservation psychology, and any kind of ecological conference, I think, is just such a great sort of ripe ground for bringing in this other perspective. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Looks like we have a few other questions. So from Anne, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Sara. I feel really inspired, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and interested in working with horses and people in reciprocal healing. And I'm just curious if your dissertation is published, if it's available. I would love to read it and to see your references, to just do a little further exploration.
Yeah, it will be published any day now. I'm honestly not sure if it just kind of went through ProQuest and it should be published soon. But there is an article that's going to be coming out in the next month or two that actually has one of the articles from my dissertation within it. And that is coming out in the Society and Animals Journal. And the name of that article is Activist as Symptom, Healing Trauma in a Ruptured Collective. And so that has a lot of the ideas that I spoke about today. And so you can check that out in the next issue of.
Sara, you can send to us, to Kerulos, either a PDF of your dissertation and that article or the link to it or any links, and we can also post that on your interview.
Okay, great.
As well, just to give people access.
Yeah.
Thank you. That'd be wonderful. Thanks.
Rita, would you like to unmute yourself? Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah. It's been great. I wanted to comment on the something that Gay brought up, which was culture. And I just have this sense, and it's particularly when I talk to friends and family, this idea that there's a culture in this society we live in, particularly of meat eating. And it's kind of a foodie kind of, it's the only way I can think of it, food culture. So the idea of not having wine and cheese or all these things that go with it all seems to be something that is so pervasive that I don't know if there's, how do you go there? I mean, because all my friends that know I'm vegan, they will apologize to me when we're eating together because they feel guilty, clearly. But I think the culture of food is so deep. Anyway, that's my question. Or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, that's one of the reasons for some of these defenses is that it's hard for people to imagine changing their lifestyle. It's hard for them to imagine or even think that they would be okay, right, if they were to give up some of these things. And I think, though, that there are so many deeper roots to that culture that are, both kind of individually determined, but also, as you said, culturally determined. This idea that is a necessary kind of part of our dinner parties, part of our everyday life, I think is conditioned by so many of these kind of, different capitalist industrial food systems, right? And that's part of where the resistance, and so that's part of why there are so many different collective and individual layers of defenses against really seeing what goes on behind the scenes there, and not just seeing it, but really then letting it in. Because I think once you see it and you let it in and you find a way to keep going, it's hard. And that's sort of like the depressive position in a way. Melanie Klein, who's an object relations theorist, right, talks about depressive position where you integrate the good and the bad together, and you come to, in a way that, people who are, I think, in that sort of there's like a manic food system, right? We don't want to see it. We're eating, we're gorging, we're kind of we're staying above that knowledge. Right. And so once we sink in and sink below, then I think that wine and cheese doesn't mean the same thing to us anymore. It takes on a whole other meaning.
The wine might.
Wine's okay.
I just put in the chat thing, there's a book called Turning Points in Compassion. It was edited by Gypsy Wolf and another woman, I've forgotten her name. I find it a very wonderful book to read. It's about, I don't know, 100 different essays by individuals who became plant-based eaters. And they tell their story, and they come from all walks of life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's fascinating. It's a very inspiring, and it's very, it gives a lot of food for thought.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because there's this thing, and I don't know if Molly or somebody would like to talk about it, but there's this thing called the Liberation Pledge. I don't know if people are familiar with it, and Molly can elaborate on it further, but basically it's a pledge. It's online, called the Liberation Pledge, and there's 3 things. One is, Molly, will you chip in? My memory bank. There's 3 things, and I can't even remember 3 things.
Yeah. So essentially you, the first part of the pledge is just that you abstain from eating animal products. And the second is that you abstain from gatherings where there are foods taken from animals involuntarily. And then you speak out about why that is, and you try to invite people into gatherings that don't involve those foods. So it's essentially it's rupturing that piece of the culture, right? As you were saying, it's bringing up a very taboo subject openly, even with colleagues, family, friends in all areas of life, and trying to have those conversations in a way that people can hear them, but brings up a lot, creates a lot of difficult moments socially. But then in my experience, it also creates deeper understanding and more authenticity in those relationships. And over time, a lot of understanding, and people actually are supportive. And in my life, I've just got, a handful of people who've really resisted, but everybody else has come along. Yeah, Sarah, thank you so much. This is just really so affirming of my experiences. And I know so many people in my community who have had these experiences. I think we talked to each other a few years ago, right, about some of my experiences with the slaughterhouse vigils. And your research is so pertinent. I'm just wondering, for those of us who are not trained to hold these types of gatherings and to help people process this type of grief, if you have any thoughts about how to support your vision, because we need to replicate you 5 million times, how can we be creating these spaces for those of us who don't have that kind of background?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's definitely giving me more food for thought of kind of creating a structure, even just, starting. It doesn't have to, be intensive depth psychotherapy groups to begin with, right? It can just be in some ways a space where feelings are invited, right? Where a space feeling positive space, right? That may be separate from other advocacy spaces, may be part of the advocacy spaces where feelings are normalized, where feelings within the, expressing feelings within the organization are normalized. And just giving people time to check in individually about how they're doing and what they're experiencing. I mean, it can start out with something as simple as that. That's a way of undoing aloneness, right? And beginning to open up and normalize that. But I'm going to think more about your question, and maybe that'll be my next project, creating some templates and for those kinds of groups. Thanks for that question, Molly. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
Part of the reason we were having these webinars and Kerulos is having other kinds of, the Kerulos constellation is another sort of a sub website, Facebook type of thing. Are collection points for people to share and talk and connect. That's really, and discussion, essentially that's what Living One is. The purpose of that is to start connect. I'm looking at the screen right now, and it's got all these little mosaics of faces, and those are, connections that are now made, and people can talk to each other and exchange, and I think that that's a really important part, is to see connection, sort of. Instead of feeling the alienation, is to also see that the connections are already there. The other point that I'd like to make, that I do for myself, and I don't always follow through with it because I still have a proclivity, even though I'm kind of an introvert, to have human contact, is we're connected with non-humans. And again, I repeat myself, but I just love it so much. John Seed, an environmentalist in Australia, made this, comment years and years ago, which now I've bastardized into this thing, which is probably far from what he said, but it's so beautiful. He was with friends and they were protesting, literally using their bodies to block bulldozers from mowing over illegally these rainforests in Australia. And he had this revelation, and he said, I realized, that I was not, a human defending a rainforest. I was the rainforest in human form, defending itself. I found that a really powerful thing for me personally, is to really start to live and live beyond form, live beyond this, kind of minimize the outside part. And I think, Sarah, you were bringing up those threads too, where you were talking about, instead of, seeing the person who is the enemy, the hunter, or whatever, seeing them as that, to reconfigure them in such a way that invites a point of contact and dialogue. I have a hard time with it when I see someone trespassing criminally and shooting my our wild turkeys. I really have a hard time. I mean, I've gotten good because I'm not screaming at them immediately. And I do try to open the door for dialogue. But, I think that's one of the challenges is the being faced with the violence, the incredible violence in juxtaposition with the gentleness. But anyways, just that kind of notion of just the, of really spending time and making tangible, that these connections and community exists, in its many forms. And Sarah, thank you for really articulating that and bringing that into the world.
Yeah, thank you. I just you made me remember that actually at the conference, the hunter himself who made that comment came up to me and thanked me for standing up to him, which was very interesting. And after that happened, I started wondering, well, in a way, was he asking, is what I'm doing an act of love? Because he was asking genuinely for himself, perhaps. And so, there are so many ways to build these bridges.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for sharing. And we're all waiting with bated breath for your dissertation to be published. So we'll definitely have that available through Kerulos for folks once that is published through ProQuest. And thank you all for taking time out of your weekend. I mean, we know that time is precious, so we do appreciate all of you being here. And today's presentation will be available on our website as well as on YouTube. So if you'd like to share what we've talked about today with others, please feel free to do so. Share widely if you would. So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we will see you next month on July 11th.
And thank you, Liz and Lauren.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
everyone.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye.